The United States has just dropped its National Security Strategy 2025, and buried inside its America First shield is a message that might just send shockwaves across India. This is not another glossy vision document full of shared values and soaring rhetoric. This is a blunt instrument. India, once framed as a leading global power and democratic counterweight to China, has been quietly, deliberately downplayed. President Trump's second-term NSS talks less about partners and more about costs, burdens, and returns. It is obsessed with borders, factories, tariffs, energy dominance, and power consolidation at home. India appears only in flashes, functional and transactional, no longer celebrated, only assessed. So what does it mean when Washington stops selling friendship and starts calculating utility? And how does this reshaping of America's priorities hit India's diplomatic future? Hello and welcome. You're watching Statecraft with me, Geeta Mohan. To understand why this matters, you have to see the NSS 2025 for what it is. A rejection of how America has explained itself to the world for decades. Where earlier strategies spoke of leadership and shared responsibility, this one speaks of survival, sovereignty, and selective engagement. India is no longer central to a grand Indo-Pacific story. It is a piece in a narrower American equation. Trump's America is pulling inward even as it demands more from others, and the downgrade in tone from Biden's 2024 NSS to Trump's 2025 document raises alarm for India. Is this strategic realism an opportunity for autonomy, or a warning that New Delhi matters less than it thinks? The 2025 National Security Strategy is built around a single, unapologetic idea. America First is no longer a slogan. It is a filter through which every region, relationship, and risk is judged. The document mocks past US strategies as unfocused laundry lists that tried to manage the entire world and failed. Trump presents himself as the correction, the man who stopped America from bleeding resources into endless commitments and ideological crusades. This NSS is about defending the US as a sovereign republic, securing borders, crushing mass migration, rebuilding industry, dominating energy, and ensuring military superiority.
I think at a macro level, the key thing I'll be reading for is what it says about China. Because, the national defense strategy is a defense strategy, right? And so it's not going to be talking about US-China trade, most likely. What it will be talking about is the extent to which the US military still sees China as the pacing threat. And furthermore, whether in the context of homeland defense being the top priority, which of course it was under Biden as well, whether the Chinese threat to the homeland is one that this administration is taking seriously alongside other threats that it perceives, for example, from drugs, from migrants, and so on. And so to me, the most important thing when we really think about the defining competition between the US and China for this century is going to be whether the Pentagon keeps its eye on the ball in terms of the China challenge, or whether it pivots in a different direction in such a way that could cause us to lose some significant ground.
Everything else is secondary. Alliances exist to serve these goals, not the other way around. For India, this shift matters because Washington is no longer asking who shares its values, but who shares its load. India's reduced visibility in the document is not accidental. The NSS 2025 mentions India only 4 times, all in functional contexts. When India is mentioned, it is almost always in the context of utility. The strategy calls for improving commercial relations with India to encourage New Delhi to contribute more actively to Indo-Pacific security, particularly through the Quad. The language is telling. The goal is not mutual security, but inducement. Trade becomes leverage. Cooperation becomes conditional. India is grouped alongside European and Asian allies as part of a broader effort to enlist partners for American priorities, whether in critical minerals, Africa, or countering China's supply chain dominance. This is not strategic courtship. it is strategic recruitment. The contrast with the Biden-era framing is stark. The earlier strategy spoke of integrated deterrence, co-development of technologies, and long-term institutional alignment. It treated India's rise as beneficial to American interests. The 2025 NSS, by contrast, reflects unease about relative power shifts. There is an undercurrent of suspicion that India's growth may not always align neatly with American priorities.
The post-Cold War trajectory of American grand strategy has not been perfect. And in embracing a sort of liberal universalism after the fall of the Soviet Union, the United States definitely did overreach. And you look, for example, at the war in Iraq as a prime example of massive expenditure of American resources in pursuit of political objectives that weren't actually attainable and at great human cost. So I do think we need to take seriously elements of that critique. And you add on to that the fact that, Gallup asks Americans every year whether they're satisfied or dissatisfied with America's role in the world. And every single year since 2006, the majority of Americans have reported that they are dissatisfied. So you have some high-profile policy failures, you have broad public dissatisfaction. And so we do need to take a hard look at some of the core assumptions that have guided American foreign policy since the early 90s and question whether they need to be revised. However, we need to do that alongside also a fair assessment of the achievements, because many of the elements of US policy that this administration excoriate, for example, key elements of the liberal international order, have actually provided unprecedented prosperity and security for the United States. So we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. And I worry that this take on the future of America's role in the world goes too far in correcting for these perceived failures and turning us in a direction that will actually make the American people less secure and less prosperous.
Experts suggest that Washington increasingly views India not as a strategic investment, but as a liability. Too independent, too unwilling to make concessions, too committed to multi-alignment to fit neatly into a US-led bloc. This recalibration is inseparable from Trump's broader worldview. The NSS repeatedly criticizes previous administrations for overextension, for acting like Atlas holding up the world order. Trump's answer is retrenchment without retreat. The United States will still be powerful, still intervention capable, but only where its core interests are directly at stake. The Western Hemisphere becomes the top priority. Migration control dominates strategic thinking. Cartels, borders, and nearshoring outrank distant theaters. The Indo-Pacific remains important, but it is no longer the emotional centerpiece of American strategy. It is one theater among many, and partners within it are expected to shoulder more of the burden. For India, this has immediate implications. The NSS makes clear that burden sharing is non-negotiable. Allies are expected to spend more, contribute more, and align more closely with US economic and security goals. Reciprocity replaces reassurance. This creates friction in areas where India has historically guarded its autonomy: trade policy, defense procurement, and strategic positioning. The strategy's insistence on balanced trade and its embrace of tariffs as tools of reindustrialization raise the risk of renewed trade disputes. America's pro-worker framing leaves little room for sentimentality about emerging market sensitivities. The migration section of the document also carries quieter signals for India. The NSS explicitly rejects the idea that global talent should be allowed to undercut American labor. It frames merit-based immigration not as an asset, but as a loophole. For India's STEM workforce, long accustomed to seeing the US as an open destination, this represents a closing door. The strategy does not mention India by name here, but the implication is unmistakable. America first means American jobs first, even if that disrupts long-standing people-to-people ties. Trump's self-congratulatory peace narrative adds another layer of complexity. The NSS credits the president with brokering peace between India and Pakistan, portraying Washington as the decisive force preventing nuclear escalation. This framing subtly diminishes Indian agency and reinforces the idea of South Asia as a problem set managed by American deal-making rather than regional balance. It also keeps Pakistan in the picture, reminding New Delhi that Washington's engagement with Islamabad has not vanished, even if it is less visible. The Indo-Pacific section underscores how conditional India's relevance has become. India is valuable insofar as it contributes to Quad deterrence, secures supply chains, and aligns with US technology standards. There is no guarantee of support in bilateral crises. The NSS is notably silent on India's border tensions with China, signaling a reluctance to entangle the US in conflicts that do not directly threaten American prosperity. This silence contrasts very sharply with earlier rhetoric that emphasized shared concern over coercion and territorial disputes. Economics sits at the heart of the strategy, and here too, India faces a mixed landscape. On one hand, the NSS opens space for cooperation in critical minerals, technology, and manufacturing. On the other, its emphasis on reshoring and tariff protection threatens India's export ambitions. The United States wants supply chain independence, not diversification for its own sake. India is useful as an alternative to China, but only if that alternative serves American industrial revival rather than competing with it. Chinese strategic assessments included in the material suggest that Beijing reads the NSS as evidence of American retrenchment rather than retreat. From this perspective, Washington is buying time, pulling back selectively to rebuild economic strength before reasserting itself later. In that interim, alliances become transactional bridges rather than ideological bonds. India, in this reading, is no longer a cornerstone but a variable. That perception alone has consequences, particularly if it emboldens China along contested borders. The NSS's heavy emphasis on sovereignty and non-intervention resonates superficially with India's own preferences, but the similarity is deceptive. For Washington, sovereignty is a shield against obligations. For New Delhi, it has often been a basis for strategic flexibility. When both sides prioritize sovereignty, cooperation requires more negotiation, not less. Every joint initiative becomes a bargain rather than an assumption. The reduction in India's salience also reflects a broader shift away from the democracy versus autocracy framing that once elevated New Delhi symbolically. The 2025 NSS explicitly rejects ideological crusades. It respects differences rather than seeking convergence. That removes one of the soft pillars that previously supported India's elevated status in US strategy. What remains is hard utility, ports, minerals, markets, and maritime reach. This does not mean the relationship collapses. It means it becomes thinner, sharper, and more conditional. India gains room to maneuver but loses insulation. There is less automatic goodwill, less rhetorical cushioning when interests diverge. The Quad survives, but as a tool rather than a vision. Technology cooperation continues, but tied to American standards and expectations. Diplomatic warmth gives way to strategic accounting. In that sense, the 2025 NSS is not hostile to India, but it is indifferent to sentiment. It treats New Delhi as one partner among many in a crowded field of American priorities. It reflects an America more anxious about itself than invested in shaping others. For India, the challenge is not rejection but relevance. How to remain useful without becoming dependent, how to engage without overcommitting, and how to navigate a partnership where praise has been replaced by pressure. Ultimately, the document tells us less about India's standing and more about America's state of mind. This is a strategy born of perceived decline, obsessed with control, and wary of generosity. In such a world, relationships are renegotiated constantly, and silence can be as revealing as emphasis. India is not sidelined, but it is no longer spotlighted. And in a strategy that counts, that quiet recalibration may be the loudest message of all. Thank you for watching Statecraft.